All right, let's dive right into an explainer covering one of the most complex and, honestly, paradoxical nations in modern history. Today, we're unpacking the story of Zimbabwe. It's a country with a narrative that's just as rich as it is incredibly turbulent. You know, Zimbabwe is a place absolutely packed with natural resources. We're talking gold, platinum, and incredibly fertile soil. It has this proud, ancient heritage and a really deep history of resilience. But, and here's the paradox, it went from being internationally celebrated as the breadbasket of Southern Africa to a nation practically paralyzed by severe political and economic turmoil. It's a really stark contrast that's left economists and historians completely puzzled. So, the big question is, how exactly did a nation with so much immense potential spiral into a generation-defining crisis? Well, to figure that out, we've got to look way past the modern headlines. We really need to trace a single, unbroken thread that runs right through its entire history, and that is the intense struggle for land and identity. Here's how we're going to tackle this explainer today. We'll kick things off with ancient roots and empires, then look at the colonial takeover, the struggle for independence, the Mugabe era, the resulting land and economic crisis, and finally, we'll wrap up with Zimbabwe's enduring cultural heritage. All right, moving to Section 1, Ancient Roots and Empires, and the Foundations of Zambezia. Now, what's fascinating here is that long before any European contact, Shona-speaking dynasties built these massive, super intricate stone cities known as Great Zimbabwe. We're talking colossal dried stone walls acting as a massive hub for the gold and ivory trade. It totally proves there was a highly organized pre-colonial political structure already in place. Actually, early European explorers literally refused to believe indigenous Africans could have built something so magnificent. But modern archaeology has undeniably confirmed it as a brilliant local triumph. Next up, Section 2, the colonial takeover. We'll look at roads, concessions, and the pioneer column. The trajectory of these ancient lands took a really violent turn in the 19th century as European powers pushed into the continent's interior. You can track this rapid, aggressive takeover starting in 1888 with the Rudd Concession, which locked down mining rates for Cecil Rhodes. Then, by 1890, a heavily armed expedition, the Pioneer Column, arrived near present-day Harare, staking their claim. Fast forward to 1923, and the territory was officially annexed as Southern Rhodesia, complete with a constitution that totally entrenched white minority rule. This aggressive push displaced local populations and essentially laid the groundwork for a deeply unequal society. And this massive land divide brilliantly illustrates the core of the entire conflict. Just think about this. By the time independence rolled around, a tiny fraction of the population, about 4,500 white commercial farmers, controlled the vast bulk of the 15 million hectares of prime arable land. Meanwhile, millions of black Zimbabweans were pushed into the remaining, mostly less productive territories. It's a staggering disparity. That brings us to Section 3, the struggle for independence, specifically the Rhodesian Bush War. So, as you can probably guess, this massive inequality directly fueled a fierce liberation struggle in the 1960s and 70s. The resistance actually split into two main nationalist factions. You had ZANU, led by figures like Robert Mugabe, operating mostly out of the east with backing from Mozambique and taking ideological cues from Mao Zedong. On the other side was ZAPU, led by Joshua Nkomo in the west, supported by Zambia and tied to the African National Congress. They definitely had different regional allies and strategies, but they were absolutely united in one goal: overthrowing the Rhodesian government. Things escalated quickly into a really devastating guerrilla war. The everyday reality of the Bush War meant round-the-clock bombardments, cross-border guerrilla infiltration, hit-and-run raids with landmines, and brutal martial law crackdowns by the white minority government. It severely scarred the whole countryside and pulled in a lot of international involvement. Eventually, the sheer unsustainable violence forced everyone to the negotiating table, which ultimately led to the 1979 Lancaster House Agreement. All right, let's move into Section 4, the Mugabe era, marking the transition from independence to authoritarianism. The early days of a newly independent Zimbabwe in the 1980s, man, they were filled with incredible optimism. They brought in socialist-based economic policies, massively expanded education, and agricultural exports were absolutely booming. The nation was literally seen as the shining light of Africa. But that sharply contrasts with the political reality that hit in the 1990s. We see the ruling ZANU-PF party heavily consolidating power, suppressing opposition voices, and building this growing system of state-sponsored patronage. It's a stark reminder of how fast democratic optimism can fade when power gets too centralized. Now, let's talk about a very specific number: 300,000. That is the massive number of farm workers employed by white commercial farmers right at independence. I really want to highlight this because it shows just how deeply tangled those colonial land structures were with the baseline economy. To abruptly disrupt that land ownership meant risking the livelihoods of hundreds of thousands of workers, not to mention the very bedrock of the nation's economy. Which leads right into Section 5, the land and economic crisis, triggered by the fast-track land reform. This was the tipping point where political survival and unresolved historical grievances collided in a really disastrous way. Facing unprecedented pushback from trade unions and new coalitions, including a huge national strike in '98, and then unexpectedly losing a constitutional referendum in February 2000, the ruling party kind of panicked. By June 2000, they launched these highly controversial, state-supported fast-track land invasions to violently reclaim white-owned farms. It was primarily a tactic to rally political support, but it essentially sent the nation's fragile stability into a total tailspin. The fallout? Absolutely catastrophic. With agricultural production collapsing, the entire agrarian economy just fell apart. We saw a massive exodus of commercial farmers and their workers, leading straight to severe food shortages. And that triggered this vicious cycle of unprecedented hyperinflation. I mean, the currency became practically worthless. Throw in severe human rights violations against political opponents and international isolation, and the former breadbasket of Africa tragically became an international pariah. Okay, on to our final section, number 6, enduring cultural heritage, focusing on identity, music, and resilience. Despite all these towering political and economic tragedies, you absolutely cannot ignore the profound cultural resilience of the Zimbabwean people. The fabric of the country is this incredibly rich, multicultural tapestry. It's got a super diverse linguistic heritage. Shona is spoken by nearly 80% of the population, alongside Sindebele, Nambia, Kalanga Soto groups, and over 20 indigenous homelands. These communities have constantly navigated between their pre-colonial roots and post-colonial debates, holding fast to their identity even when the state was failing. It really just goes to show that a nation's true foundation is its people. Consider this powerful ancient biblical lament. How shall we sing the Lord's song in a strange land? It perfectly captures the deep historical pain of having sacred ancestral shrines profaned by colonizers. That very sentiment sparked intense cultural resistance movements, like the 1910 Shirugwi Uprising, where people actively tried to reassemble their ritual objects to connect with their deities and guide them through the darkness of colonial rule. And later on, when direct speech was heavily censored in the post-independence era, art and music became an absolute lifeline. Take Thomas Matfumo's Jidi music, for example. It's this vibrant, energetic style deeply influenced by the traditional mbira instrument. It functioned as a brilliant celebration of their heritage, sure, but it also acted as a covert vehicle to critique government failures. It kept the spirit of accountability alive when conventional politics literally couldn't. So when we zoom out and look back at this entire history, what do we see? We see a story of immense potential that was just repeatedly thwarted, first by colonial segregation, then by severely skewed land ownership, and finally by post-independence political mismanagement. The unresolved legacy of the land and the ongoing marginalization of citizens, those have consistently been the primary drivers of Zimbabwe's ongoing struggles. Fast forward a bit to the 2017 military intervention that finally ended Robert Mugabe's long rule. Emerson Mnangagwa stepped into power, and in his inaugural address, he stated quite plainly, there is no justification for human rights violations. It was an explicit promise of a new dispensation and a return to the rule of law. Both the international community and the citizens of Zimbabwe have been watching very closely ever since to see if those promises actually translate into real systemic change. Which brings us to a final, really critical thought to leave you with today. Can a nation that's so deeply scarred by the struggle for its own land truly reconcile its past to rebuild a stable, equitable future? As Zimbabwe continues to navigate the long shadows of its complex history, we're left wondering if the lessons mined from its storied chronicle will finally allow this incredibly resilient nation to realize its vast potential. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll catch you on the next one.